we need a kind of third way, that we can't go in this sort of atavistic populist direction that I think national conservatism is too close to. We can't go either in the sort of hyper neoliberal libertarian direction of the so-called right, which either comes in globalized forms, or with Elon Musk you get a kind of hybrid with populism. It's very dishonest, you know. But so that we need a sort of, instead of that, we need a thicker universalism. You know, we need to look back to the great axial traditions, you know.
Welcome to the Spe Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. How about you?
I'm doing very well and looking forward to our conversation today because we have a very special guest. We are delighted today to be joined by John Milbank. John Milbank is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. He's well known as the founder of the Radical Orthodoxy movement. He's the author of many articles and books. Most notably, we'll recommend to our listeners today his seminal Theology and Social Theory Beyond Secular Reason. John Milbank, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. One small correction is that I'm now Emeritus Professor in the Department of Philosophy, because the Department of Theology is no more, I'm afraid. It's completely subsumed within philosophy now at Nottingham. So my official title is Emeritus Professor within philosophy. But
well,
that's the way it is. Yeah.
Sorry to hear about the demise of theology in Nottingham, but I'm sure, you know, there's some overlap there with philosophy.
The people are still there. But they're just within philosophy. You know, this is the kind of way the humanities are going, as you know, everywhere.
Yeah. Well, as I said, we're just delighted to talk to you today, and we want to delve into to theology and social sciences and the things that you're known for in just a moment. But I guess the pretext for inviting you on was Bobby and I both really appreciated an article that you recently published over at the Catholic Herald, where you address some of the issues that are really at the forefront of kind of in our public consciousness now, with regard to kind of, you know, these issues about identity and, you know, so many of these questions that are kind of coming to a boil in Great Britain, but also in America. And we just thought it was, you know, what you wrote in that article was such a it was timely, but one of the things we like to do in our work, in our kind of modest endeavor here at the Spe Salvi Institute, is to use these opportunities of crisis, as it were, as times to do the deepest level of thinking. Now is the time to think, rather than just to kind of offer opinions. So I wonder if you could just, you know, you talk about how, you know, you talk about the anti-immigrant riots in the UK and election hysteria in the United States. I think most people listening will shake their heads in affirmation. Yes, those things are happening. But you make some very interesting claims about that. You say both are symptoms of a crisis of Anglo-Celtic identity. And then you go on to develop in the piece a really interesting perspective on where we are with regard to universalism and particularism. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about this article that you've written.
Yes, I mean, you significantly mentioned the word crisis. One's almost tempted to say that every serious crisis is a crisis of the one, or maybe a crisis of the one in relation to the many. That so many of our problems about the articulation of unity in relation to diversity, I think. And so my article, well, it made several points, but I think it was most fundamentally suggesting that we've got a kind of standoff today between a very abstract kind of universalism on the one hand, and a particularism on the other hand that can often turn quite nasty, because all that people have to fall back on is their nations or their religions reduced to identity or their racial identity. And quite often those sort of local traditions have themselves been quite thinned out by modernity. You know, they're often a kind of sad echo of what they once were. But we seem to have that kind of oscillation. And I think I was trying to suggest that maybe for Christians or even religious people in general, we've got to be very wary of siding with one side of that or another, you know. And maybe that's because our sense of how the universal relates to the particular is quite different. That above all, we think of the universal as something transcendent. So it's not a kind of system that human beings have mastered. It's not a system of formal relations. It's a reference to the transcendent good, you know, as a more than human reality. And so we have the sense that we participate in that in ways that are always particular, even if they strive towards some kind of universal harmony. And perhaps a key point that I tried to make was that I think sort of liberalism has the sense that the universal is primarily linked to the individual and to the reason, so that we have the idea that if we think of everybody as isolated individuals, what brings them together are some kind of rational processes and some kind of shared agreement to value the freedom we all want, or the material happiness that we all want. And then on the other hand, we have the sense that very particular traditions, you know, including religions, are just sort of kind of arbitrary collective biases, just things that have been handed down. And I think that sort of totally ignores the fact that universals aren't, first of all, discovered by isolated individuals. On the contrary, you know, the move from the tribal to what you can roughly call the state or empire, that's often linked to, you know, what historians have come to call the axial turn, the invention of the great religions, and a great sense of religious transcendence and so forth. But that is very much the brought about by an entire society, by an entire culture. So it's not sort of individuals representing the rational truth. It's not sort of invented by a sort of John Rawls type figure or something like that. It's on the contrary, it's a whole way of doing things, such that it's a society and its practices that is itself trying to represent something universal, you know. And so I think the danger is that if we forget that, then we don't have a genuine universal. We don't have a genuine universal that is proposing some sort of positive vision of what it is to be a flourishing human being. You know, what is going to make you live well, live the good life, be genuinely fulfilling, you know. And this isn't simply the pursuit of freedom of choice or, material happiness. That leads to an obsessive consumerism, or a society where, if it's anything round you like it is round here, basically it's a lot of individuals endlessly trying to improve their bodies by jogging, and the only people they've got left to look after are their dogs, of far too many, and that doesn't seem to be a way of human fulfillment, which the great classical civilizations of East and West have seen to be something to do with contemplating the cosmos or transcendence, or being artistically creative, or taking a participatory role in society and politics. Being active in sharing in a process of self-government, if you like, real democracy, not like what we've got at the moment, but a much more genuine kind of democracy. And obviously that involves, all those things involve discrimination. What is the truth about the cosmos? What is the genuinely beautiful? How should we live our lives? So it's not that we've got fixed answers to these, but that you have the idea that society should be organized around a continuous dialectic, as Plato and Aristotle put it, a debate about what the good life is, the good and the true and the beautiful, as we carry them out, an attempt to discern those things. And unless we try to discern those things and distribute them well, then it seems that all we've got in common are sort of money and power, and that people will compete to have more money and power, and the supposedly more educated will get more money and power than other people. And at the most, you'll have something like an equality of opportunity. And unless we're aiming for something more than that, we won't even have equality of opportunity. So that, my kind of Christian argument, which I think will be in accord with Catholic social teaching, is that unless we're kind of pursuing the objective good and the objective common good, any kind of attempt to have equality is not really going to work. And that may be at an angle to our contemporary senses of right and left and so on, because if you're trying to discern, then, objective education matters, and listening to the wise matters, and being governed by the wise. And I think at the moment, the trouble is we don't have wise. We have very bad elites and influencers, but you need that to, I think, foment genuine democratic debate and genuine democratic involvement, for the reasons that I've said. So there's a sort of mixture of hierarchy and equality going on there that I think the best political thinkers have always discerned is going to be necessary, but that our contemporary discourse seems to me to totally disallow. I'm probably getting away from the article, but I think another point that I said in the article, I said that, well, first of all, we need to realize that, the genuine universalism comes out of religious traditions, big civilizational traditions. So we don't want globalization, but we don't want nationalism. And I'm bitterly opposed to national conservatism and Christians who are going on in that direction. I do want to underline, I think that's a sort of instrumental using of religion. But what I think we need to talk about is the way that genuine universalism comes from sort of thick civilizational religious traditions, that transcend, mere nations. And if you like, that's a different kind of globalization. But obviously, then we do have rival universalisms, and then we have the difficult and that's why, in a sense, interreligious dialogue is now a political exigency in a certain kind of way, I think, or needs to become more like that. And we need to understand the ways in which there can be shared vision across those universalisms, but there are also significant differences, and we have to work out how we live alongside each other. And that can sometimes mean that we do actually need our different spaces. That a society organized on Islamic principles, understood in a sophisticated way, is not necessarily a bad idea, but it doesn't follow from that we want our Western countries to be organized like that. I mean, and the more you had too much of that, the danger of it leading to civil conflict would be genuinely there. It's not a matter of sort of hating our neighbor. It's much more a matter of a sort of prematurity. At the eschaton, we will all live in harmony, but on the way there, we sometimes need our spaces to do our slightly different things, as well as having areas where we can, share our things. But I think I was suggesting also beyond that it's possible that a Christian vision or a Catholic vision is particularly concerned with mediating the universal and the particular, in that it has a very strong sense of the place of the person, the place of free association, the place of cooperative bodies within the whole, so that possibly there's a particularly strong sense here, especially because the Christian revelation is in a person rather than a law or something like that. There's a particularly strong sense that our sense of the universal is only mediated by particular cultures. The particular, I think, in the case of the Catholic Church, it incarnates in very different ways in different places, and yet there is a recognizable sort of mediation between those things. And I think common to all Christian tradition, this sense that there are persons in relations, that it's not just a matter of the isolated individual, nor is it a matter of collective power overriding individuals. But also, I think, a very strong sense of the role of the few as mediating between the one and the many. And I think the few can mean both the need for the wise that I've already mentioned, but also the role of corporate bodies associating with each other. So another illusion, alongside the idea that the universal is connected to a sort of rationalist vision of the individual, is the idea that that political order is a contract between isolated individuals, or that economic order is a sort of market mechanism that mediates between isolated individuals exercising sort of rational choice and having various sort of isolated needs and demands. Because I think that's just not historically true. I think that individuals are always already existing in various forms of groups of bodies, so that a political order is only a kind of super body of lots of smaller bodies, if you like, and a more natural pre-modern economy is mediating between different relatively self-sufficient entities, rather than this sort of ever-expanding, ever more global mediation between isolated consumers and isolated workers who can be deployed absolutely anywhere, you know. So I think that's kind of the degree of truth that I see in somebody like Edmund Burke, and even in Joseph de Maistre, in terms of his considerations on France, where, you know, his critique of the French Revolution, that the thrust of both thinkers seems to be that the revolution is sort of set up on impossible premises. It's trying to abolish corporations and guilds, and it's trying to abolish estates, and yet, in a certain sense, we still haven't abolished estates. You know, there are still workers, there are still armies and political rulers, there are still merchants, and there are still priesthoods. They're now called scientists. You know, that priests are now called scientists. Yeah, it's one reason why sort of Auguste Comte's positivism was a kind of secularized reworking of the thought of those Catholic reactionaries, I think, you know. So that, I mean, the conservative bit of my thought would be that you can't actually get rid of this idea of a corporation of corporations. And in a very loose sense, you can't get rid of this sort of Indo-European tripartition between estates. You know, that it will always return in some sort of twisted form. So that it's much better to try to actually acknowledge those realities, and then think sort of, how do we have a more egalitarian version of those things? You know, that we never get rid of mixed constitution. Actually, it's always a matter of the one and the few and the many. You know, even if we want to have a more democratic version of that. You know, and in many ways, the idea of representative democracy requires something like that, I think. And similarly, you know, I do think that Catholic thought needs to reconsider social thought, the idea of corporatism again, which was once kind of at its core. You know, this isn't necessarily fascistic at all. And in fact, you know, increasingly historians seem to say that the post-war order was a kind of modified corporatism in America or Germany and France, and even to some extent in Britain. You know, it wasn't predicated just on individual rights or utilitarian efficiency. It was a new kind of somewhat Christian social compact between businesses, government, unions, churches, other kind of civil society bodies. And the person who's written about this most brilliantly is actually the secular thinker Michael Lind, in the case of the United States, and I think he's made this case most forcibly, and I think with the most kind of detail of evidence. Yeah. So again, I'm probably going quite a long way from the article, but I suppose in relation to the article, what that comes down to is that we need a kind of third way, that we can't go in this sort of atavistic populist direction that I think national conservatism is too close to. We can't go either in the sort of hyper neoliberal libertarian direction of the so-called right, which either comes in globalized forms, or with Elon Musk you get a kind of hybrid with populism. It's very dishonest, you know. But so that we need a sort of, instead of that, we need a thicker universalism. You know, we need to look back to the great axial traditions, you know, to Christ, to Buddha, to Confucius, to Muhammad, even, you know, these forgers of, you know, thicker civilizational visions that are linked to a transcendent goal that we're sort of groping towards, but we have some intimations of, you know. And therefore, on the one hand, there needs to be a big interreligious conversation, I think, about how we could have, if you like, a sort of perennialist third way. And yet at the same time, we need not to lose hold of our sort of specific Christian commitments and our specific Christian sense that maybe this allows more for sort of free diversity than the other visions, you know, that it has a stronger sense of the relative difference between the secular and the sacred, and definitely puts a terribly high value on the individual person and their creativity, but not in isolation with interaction. I think with other people, and so another aspect of that then would be also a refusal of a kind of right-wing Catholic integralist path, because I think that's paradoxically got too great a duality of nature and grace, and it too much thinks of the church as exercising a kind of worldly power. You know, it's lost the distinction between power and persuasive or authority. Whereas I think we should only be theocratic in the very, very loose sense that the church is saying, yeah, we do judge you by whether you're tending to perform and enable the gospel, you know, but it's a matter of persuasion, you know, and I think it's good rather than bad if countries have some kind of establishment of Christianity that's in a sort of loosely free theocratic way, as well as some of you have put it. I like in my fantasies to think that kind of England and the Church of England a bit like that, but the reality is probably very far from that indeed. But you know, I think even in the case of the United States, the sense that there is some kind of Christian horizon has always been there. And unfortunately, that's become a matter of very extreme contestation. And I think, I mean, actually, I was kind of tweeting about this today, but I think, while on the one hand, yeah, it's good that Christianity has sort of seen religious commitment as a very sort of free act, you know, in relation to a free personal God. On the other hand, it seems rather sad that Christianity has lost its sense that it has kind of informed a whole civilization, you know, so that I think if you're Jewish or Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or something like this, it's much less a matter of sort of, do I believe or not? It's more a matter of this is the kind of mythos of this is my entire culture. You know, this is the Quran is it's just what shapes everything. You know, and I think Christians. I mean, you know, writers like Tom Holland have been saying this, or that we've lost sight of the degree to which our culture just is kind of willy-nilly Christian, you know, and the Enlightenment is, after all, kind of very late. A lot of it's Christian anyway, and it's the sort of rationalization of Christianity. And when we, people like John Gray have pointed out as well, when we face other cultures, we start to realize our, liberal democracy is actually embedded in this very, very Christian thing. So I think one way kind of over the culture wars might be if we much more kind of taught the Bible in the schools. In other words, I think it's an oddity of Christianity that somehow the Bible's always been associated with the clergy, and then sort of Greece and Rome with the laity. They become kind of good. So the clergy, maybe they'll become saints, or more likely, corrupt bishops. But the laity are supposed to be sort of like Cicero or something like this. And maybe in that sense we need to be a bit more like Jews and Muslims, and like everybody studying the Bible as well as studying, the Greek and Roman classics, and maybe Mesopotamian ones as well. We do need to globalize a bit. But why shouldn't the Bible be part of that mix? Otherwise, it's as if most people aren't allowed to know where they're coming from. Even now, so many phrases in our language are from the Bible, and yet people don't know anything about the Bible. And I think maybe if you had more of that kind of culture, you would have less of this, well, I absolutely believe or absolutely don't. Even though I think there is a sort of, there is, as I said, a sort of existential value in that. And part of the peculiarity of Christianity is it is encouraging that kind of faith personalism and existentialism, just as I think it's encouraging the more particular in the political sphere. Nonetheless, I think, and that was part of what I was saying in the article, that there can be a danger that particularly the kind of Anglo-Celtic version of Christendom is kind of so universalizing, it's so adventurous, that you lose the sense that there is some kind of thick, concrete, rooted particularity altogether, and I think maybe we then need more of this sense, that the Bible is part of our common legacy, and that however we take it, whether we're believers or not, we have some sort of respect and valuing for this. I mean, the really odd thing is that the French are much better at this than the English. You'd think it was the other way around, but it's seriously not. It's much more likely that a French Marxist will know that the Bible is a seriously important thing, Whereas in Britain, we get people like Richard Dawkins who say it's just, a lot of silly fairy stories. I think Dawkins may be kind of repenting these days. I don't want to be unfair to him, but I do think, I do see that as a kind of serious suggestion. I think a world where public education is more and more just about technical process, and then there's sort of a lot of very sort of quasi-puritanical Catholics doing homeschooling, and I understand why they do, but I'm not sure this is a great idea or a great recipe for social harmony. Do you see what I mean? I think we'd be much better off saying, look, Christianity, like it or not, is a big part of our culture. Maybe we should all be just discussing it.
No, I saw that tweet earlier today.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm living right outside of Krakow right now, and so I see exactly the point that you're making, which it seems like, people here, it's not as much the focus on, do I believe in this? It's just the common narrative that you're dwelling in it already. And so it doesn't seem to, I mean, I'm not exactly sure entirely because there are some strands that I think are moving in that
Yeah,
direction in Poland. But I like when I go to mass here, it just seems like it's so rooted in the culture. Like you said, the communists
absolutely.
would just know the Bible
Yeah,
completely.
yeah, yeah.
It's
No,
almost like a
no,
continental thing, maybe.
Poland, Poland is much more like that, definitely. And it's interesting that kind of, you know, Ireland is not like that, and the faith has vanished it almost in Ireland, and maybe because of a very kind of Jansenistic influence. And other such currents, you know, that maybe made it all very grim, puritanical, disciplinarian, individualist, and so on. Whereas, you know, if you go to Brittany, it doesn't seem like that. It seems more like still a kind of rooted folk religion. And this possibly connects, you know, with what Charles Taylor says about one reason for secularization is the sort of downgrading of the importance of the festive, you know, in favor of kind of moral discipline.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, if you take the people, like I live close
yeah,
to the the Highlanders, so the Guralde, and if you look at their culture, there's
yeah,
such a mixture of the sacred and the profane that you're
yeah,
kind of like these people are very devout, but yet at the same time, you see some things that would scandalize any kind of puritanical Catholic in America. Where
yeah,
it's like you see these sexual images all over the place, and yet they're okay with that somehow
yeah,
mixing in with their culture. And it's not
yeah.
done in like a pornographic way, but
No,
it just seems to me a little
yeah,
bit more like
yeah,
balanced.
yeah. No, I think that's right, and you know, I think there is some danger in America that even Catholicism takes on a very kind of wasp shape in some sense. You know, you kind of substitute the Pope for the Bible, except not the present Pope, Barrett. He's not okay, but you know, in general, there's this kind of extrinsicism, if you like, and after all, you know, if we do seriously believe in grace and in mediated sacramental grace, then it really isn't just all about what I think, what I believe, and so on. You know, there is an element of osmosis and belonging to an almost cultural process of an almost unconscious process of religious discovery. You know, um, it's not all on the conscious level. It can't be, and I think realizing that helps us to sort of somehow link religion to the material, to the natural. You know, after all, you know, why did God create? Why didn't God just create angels? You know, why has He created unconscious nature and so on? And it's something to do with the yeah, the importance of unconscious forces becoming spiritual and so on. You can tell I've been reading Schelling, but I mean, it's fascinating that you know Schelling is absolutely insistent that all crisis is a crisis of the one, and a crisis of the relation of the one and the many, and the historical level, this is the problem of the problem of Babel for him. There are many different languages, different societies, different gods, and so on. And you know, it's how do we have a genuine unity that brings together the one and the many, you know, and Schelling's essentially his Russian disciples like Soloviev and so on, right through to Bulgakov, are very much concerned, I think, with the same problem. And for them, this is connected to the Trinity. It's connected to the Incarnation. You know.
Go ahead, Bobby.
No, I was going to ask, I mean, a little bit more on the Schelling stuff. I'm fascinated. I actually have not read much Schelling until you've mentioned him. a little bit that you're working on him. But I know that
On and off.
Balthasar had some concerns about Schelling and some of the
Yeah.
German Romanticism.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, I mean, like you mentioned Soloviev and Bulgakov, but who Soloviev also admired was Mickiewicz, whom is the Polish Romantic. You see them also drawing on some of the best in the German
Mickiewicz is
Romantics.
his booklet, his lectures in Paris Les Slaves. That's,
Yeah.
you know, because this is that's such an important point of mediation between the sort of the Russian Romantics and the Germans. And I haven't got to the end of it yet, but his Pantadius is such a fantastic long poem. I can only read it in English, of course.
Yeah.
But it is absolutely fantastic. And I think I've got a long essay which will appear. I'm hoping to sort of finish a book on Trinitarian ontology by about next August. And this has got a long chapter where I really, really criticize Balthasar in relation to the German Romantics. I don't think he's got it right. I think it's understandable because I think he's kind of reacting against the Nazis. And so he's sort of worried about the Prometheanism and things. But I think he overplays it. And I think that actually Schelling doesn't have an aesthetics. He has a philosophy of art. And so this is a kind of philosophy of our participation in divine creativity. And I actually think that in the end, Balthasar's entire category of the aesthetic is too Kantian.
Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
It may not look like it, but I think it is. And also, Balthasar kind of endorses a duality of the sublime and the beautiful, where Schelling won't have any of it. So it's Schelling who is the more undoing of the Kantian. And after all, you know, there is no aesthetics in the Middle Ages. There is something like more like a poetics. And therefore, Schelling is nearer to, I argue, it's nearer to to that kind of thing. Although I also think it's true that in the end, Balthasar totally subordinates the beautiful to the ethical as well. And I'm critical. I've got more and more critical of Balthasar as time has gone on. I used to think he was, you know, the ultimate.
Was Balthasar though?
I'm less and less convinced by this. I think de Lubac stands the test of time, but I'm not so sure Balthasar does. There's obviously.
Could you also maybe?
There's very good stuff, but you know, he's not the big answer to everything.
What are your thoughts on? I mean, you've been writing a lot too on Charles Péguy, and like one of the figures Andrew and I were really impressed by Péguy. And it seems like he really puts an emphasis, with mentioning this kind of incarnational approach. He puts the emphasis there, and also avoiding some of the extremes too of the nationalism that you mentioned being cut off from the universal. Maybe do you have any thoughts on Péguy's importance?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can remember offhand what I think about him, but I think despite the obvious sort of excessive French nationalism, he has such a profound sense of the way the Catholic is incarnated in France, in this really rich way, that you can kind of forgive him that, because you can then see parallels in other countries. Somebody like David Jones' sense of how the Catholic relates to the British, and I like in Péguy his reading of Bergson, the way he understands. He basically sort of buys into sort of Bergson's metaphysics of creativity. He makes some slightly more kind of orthodox adjustments. And again, I would see that as much more the way to go than sort of Balthasar's sort of bias towards the contemplative, pure and simple. So, you know, that I mean, Balthasar sort of preferred Chavara to Blondel. I would be completely the other way around. For me, it's those French spiritualist thinkers who lie behind the Nouvelle Theology, and that's the really significant stuff. And it's sort of relating something like de Lubac back to Maine de Biron and Ravesson, that I think, I mean, this is what the most creative Catholic thinkers in France are now doing, not the phenomenologists. These are people much more interested in sort of reviving speculative metaphysics, but they're looking again at somebody like Ravesson, and it's as if you could have a Platonic Aristotelian vision that's more nonetheless more dynamized, a stronger sense of time and motion and creative transformation. The astonishing thing is that both Ravesson and Schelling knew each other. They interacted, and both of them have huge readings, new readings of Aristotle. I mean, Schelling's very final work is basically a reading of Aristotle. And if anything is nearer to sort of redoing the modern Aquinas, it's what Schelling and Ravesson do. It's not Hegel, because they are much nearer to a kind of classical Neoplatonic Aristotelian sort of outlook, you know, but nonetheless with this sort of very, very dynamic elements that includes, I mean, includes in Schelling's case certainly a preparedness to think of God as sort of causa sui, as well as just being there. So that's another thing that I'm focusing on at the moment, that, you know, the minority report that you get from Victorinus, Erugena, and then, of course, curiously, Descartes. Most of the tradition denies causa sui, but there is a minority tradition that is allowing it. And of course, we know that, you know, Heidegger thinks causa sui is the heart of ontotheology. This is weird because nearly everybody rejects it. And I think you have to remove all that entirely, and on the contrary, that Heidegger is sort of very conservative in denying that creativity is absolutely fundamental, and that the more you have a radically monotheistic, the sense of God is free and personal. It's not voluntarism in sort of an Ockhamite sense, but in a very different sense, that there's nothing about the objective good and true and beautiful that isn't sort of free and personal. Then I think you see that there is a sort of, even though God is, as it were, just there, but he's also bringing himself about, because the personal isn't sort of less than just being there. And what I'm sort of discovering is that, you know, Eckhart was trying to think that through, and despite the concerning bits, you can't really avoid Jacob Boehme. You can't. And this is why, I mean, Franz von Baader, who is kind of more orthodox than Schelling, and yet Boehme is absolutely central for what he's doing. So that the sense that there's some kind of weird tension between God is simply that, and yet he's also bringing himself about, you know, that and even though these are sort of one thing, that this is one way to sort of start thinking about the Trinity. And in fact, you know, this is the way Victorinus thinks about the Trinity. And although Augustine doesn't, maybe his sense of time as imaging the Trinity does really need that kind of thing. So I think, I could be wrong, but I think this is a sort of new angle on things, that by trying to pursue a metaphysics where creativity is absolutely central in the way sort of Bergson did and Whitehead did, you can connect this to the Trinity, and start asking ourselves, why do we have this sort of generation and procession in our vision of the Christian God? And I think we tend to, we don't think radically enough, but we blank that out, with it, without going in a sort of process direction, and without questioning any of thing like, divinely, God is absolutely impossible, all that. I affirm all that. Nonetheless, there is some kind of unthought horizon here, about how God is somehow past, present, and future. He's not just present. This is why, precisely because the present is only our kind of immanent category, and that it's clear that sort of Schelling is exploring that horizon, and he does so in this absolutely mad, crazy way for about 30 years, where he publishes nothing. And he's trying to sort of relate mythology, Western philosophy, and revelation, round his metaphysics of the three powers, which is really a Trinitarian metaphysics. I mean, it's clear that that's what he thinks, so yeah, I'm currently sort of trying to make some sense of that, but I've just got a long way to go. I won't get to the end of it in writing the essay I'm trying to write at the moment, or in writing that particular book.
John, on that note, I was thinking, some of our listeners might be wondering how we drift from kind of, the real world problems of, how do we manage these kind of the attempts at multiculturalism or whatever to, thinking about Trinitarian ontology or whatever. And I mean, it occurs to me that, one of the big questions that you like to answer, and that Bobby and I are interested in, we hope our listeners too, is this question of the sort of, it is really the problem of a lack of metaphysics that sort of defines a lot of the problems of liberalism in some ways.
Yeah.
Definitely. And so I just, with that kind of parentheses, it leads me to just want to ask you about something that you're so famous for, which is radical orthodoxy, and how you see kind of the legacy of radical orthodoxy, or the future of it, or how that project kind of relates to some of the, kind of not only theological questions that are being worked on in the academy, but some of these other questions that we really need to think through out in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of radical orthodoxy legacy is kind of properly and appropriately diversified, and sort of run into other sort of sympathetic currents, and I think that's all very much to the good. But I suppose what's interesting about it is in the face of postmodernism, it tried to substitute a kind of sort of Christian Platonic participatory vision, sort of understood a bit more dynamically in the way that I've already tried to indicate. And I think that people have, tried to work it out in different ways in relation to metaphysics, current philosophy, current science, current politics, and there've been a series of sort of reasonably significant interventions in all those areas, so that it's to do with trying to recover some kind of symphonic intellectual vision, which really sort of one person can't do on their own. It has to be a sort of collective enterprise, rather in the way that it was for the German Romantics, perhaps. And yeah, I mean, I hope that, just as I was talking in about a third way in politics, that we have sort of staked out something of a sort of middle ground between, in terms of radical orthodoxy, between people just a kind of increasingly flaccid liberalism where you just endorse the latest fad and you just sort of baptize the norms of wokery or something like that. I saw this amazingly funny Durham Divinity School about where they were all praying to something called the Great Queer One. It was completely hilarious. But you get maybe they made it for my entertainment. Thank you in that case. But you've got this kind of thing on the one hand, and then you have this kind of recidivism on the other hand. Going back into very tight orthodoxies, neo-scholasticism, Bartianism, this sort of thing, and it becomes very tight and buttoned up and a bit kind of nerdy, and it seems a very long way from what makes people religious, the forces that are really behind religious sensibility, including, as I've already said, unconscious forces. So that I hope that we've held open a different space, and I don't think we're coming from nowhere. We've always seen ourselves as sort of in the traditions of Nouvelle Theology, Russian Sophiology, the best of kind of high church Anglican thought. We're trying to develop those things, but I think, as you've already intimated, that there's been a lot of recovery of a better kind of approach to doctrine, reading the Bible, spirituality, but there is still something of a metaphysical gap, possibly, which is one reason why I think it's so interesting that Nouvelle Theology may have this embeddedness in a kind of philosophical metaphysics originally, but I think a fuller articulation of that metaphysics is very, very important, both in part as sort of allowing a space for mediating with non-Christians, but also insisting on the specificity of the Christian metaphysical vision, and how there are no clear boundaries between our sort of philosophical theology and our doctrinal theology. At least I don't think there are. The ultimate metaphysical vision is Trinitarian and Christological, and that's where I think even Aquinas retreats a bit by accepting the idea that there are two different theologies. Up to the 12th century, there really weren't. I would controversially say we probably got that idea from Islam, and it's a mistake. And so that, people like Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa and Ficino and people are trying to restore the sense of a unified theological vision, which is, it's true in the Boethian vision, the Maximian vision, the Erugian vision, I think I think that's much more what we need nowadays. And I think, as I've often pointed out, I think the paradox is that the people who most insisted that Christianity, Christian philosophy is Trinitarian and Christological. Raymond Lull and Nicholas of Cusa were the very people who said, look, we must talk to people in other faiths and try and get on with them.
Well,
there's something significant about that,
Yeah.
Maybe just because they're realizing that sort of the faith thing is not kind of just our kind of private possession stuck on top of something more general.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned this in the piece. This you mentioned Remy Bragg with the eccentric culture, and it just seems to me that if you don't have that kind of Trinitarian metaphysic undergirding everything, you would never actually end up. That's the best grounds for having a dialogue with people, ecumenical dialogue or interreligious dialogue. Outside of that, it just doesn't seem that you would have great grounds for that. But also, I mean, so that eccentricity having its root in the Trinity.
I like that idea. Yes, I think there's a great deal of truth in that, because I think there is a sense in which the Trinity is going beyond the contrast of the one and the many, and it's seeing mediation and relation and difference in the divine itself. Just as the idea of the incarnation, it's not just that we're telling everybody about the message of Jesus, but also we're sort of continuing to realize it, to repeat it differently, because we have to extend this incarnation of God in the human as such. And the eschaton will be the full realization of that. So I don't know whether Rumi would see things that you said in quite that way, but yes, I would tend to say that. Yes.
Do you think that we need to wind down, but maybe as a final question?
No, I'm being called for supper. I'm in trouble. So.
Oh, you are? Okay. Well, then
Mm.
maybe just one more quick question to take us back to our original material, talking about your article in the Catholic Herald. Do you think, maybe I'll just pose this kind of cheekily, do you think then that it's okay, or maybe more than okay, that it's necessary for England, for France, for Italy, for countries to really double down on their Christian identity in order to have a future?
Well, this is a really, really important question, and I think the secular story that we tell ourselves is bizarrely narrow and ethnocentric. Basically the story is, the West got to science first, the West got to enlightenment first, and that's the way everybody has to go. The West got to liberal democracy first, and whereas the reality is probably that we are much more particular than that we have never escaped a set of very specific ethnocentric assumptions, and that Enlightenment universalism probably is simply a version of Christian universalism. But beyond that, I think the danger is that if we sort of substitute for Christian universalism something much more technocratic and rationalistic, that we sell to the world, in a sense, the worst of ourselves rather than the best of ourselves, and then what we get is maybe coming from China, we get that worst of ourselves combined with a sort of a combination of their own tendency to enormous sort of state unity, but combined with stuff that they've learned from the dark traditions in the West, including Carl Schmitt, and we find ourselves powerless to resist that, or then we just develop ourselves kind of versions of that, and Germany and France could easily say, well, what the hell? We need China as a trading partner, and we need immigrants to do all the jobs. Let's just forget about being France and Germany and part of Europe and so on. So, yeah, I think without sounding too kind of decline of the West, I suspect that if we don't recover our Christian identity in some way, we could easily just go under, just vanish.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you so much, John Milbank, for joining us today on the podcast. We really appreciate your taking the time to be here.
Not at all. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, thank you for sharing this podcast, rating it, and reviewing it. We really pray that it's been a blessing to you. And so until next time, God bless and live in hope.